my mom and I moved across the city at the end of the first grade, I was sure that our friendship had seen its last day. As we drove from the house we lived on the entire life, I felt sadness that I knew it just wasn't about just a house. I was saying goodbye to my friend forever, but Josh and I had, to my surprise, had delighted stay closed. Despite the fact that we spent the majority of our time apart and only saw one another on weekends, we remained remarkably similar as we grew. Our personalities collided with our senses of humor and complement to each other's, and we would often find that we had started liking new things independently. We even had sounded enough alike windows when I stayed with Josh. He would sometimes call my mom, pretending to be me. His success rate was very impressive, and my mother would sometimes joke that the only way she could tell us apart sometimes was by our hair. He had straight, dirty blonde hair like his sister, while I had curly, brown hair like my mother. One would think that he would most likely drive the two young friends apart and would be what's out of their control. However, I think of the catalyst of our gradual disengagement was the insistence that we snuck out of the old house to look for boxes. That weekend I invited Josh over to my house, in keeping with the tradition, alternating houses, but he said that he wasn't really feeling up to it, so we started seeing progressively less over the next year or so. It had gone from once a week to once a month to once every couple of months. For my 12th birthday, my mom threw a party for me. I hadn't really had many friends since we moved, so it was a surprise party since my mom had no idea who to invite. I told the handful of kids I'd become acquainted and called Josh to see if he wanted to come. Originally, he said he didn't think that he could make it, but that day before the party, he called me and told me he was going to be there. I was really excited because I hadn't seen him in several months. The party went well. To my biggest concern was that Josh and the other kids wouldn't get along, but they seemed to really like each other well enough. Josh was surprisingly quiet. He hadn't brought me a gift, and I apologized for that, but I told him that it wasn't a big deal. I was just glad he was able to make it. I tried to start with several conversations with him, but they seemed to be reaching to dead ends. I asked him what was wrong, and when I told him that I didn't get it, why things had become awkward for between of us, when they were never like that before. We used to hang out almost every weekend on the phone, every couple days. I asked him what happened to us, and he looked up from staring at the shoes and just said, "You left." Just after he said that, my mom yelled in the kitchen in the other room. It was time to open presents. I forced a smile and then walked into the dining room as they sang happy birthday. There were a couple of wrapped boxes and a lot of cards since most of my extended family lived out of state. Most of the gifts were silly and forgettable, but I remember that Brian gave me a Mighty Max toy shaped like a snake that I kept for years afterwards. My mom insisted that I open all the cards that had been brought and thank each person who given me one, because several years before Christmas I had torn through the wrapping paper and envelopes in such a favor that it destroyed any possibility of disconcerting who had sent it which gift and the amount of money. We had separated the ones to be sent in the mail and ones that would be brought out so many days so I wouldn't have to sit through the opening of the cards from people I have never met. Most of my cards where my friends have a couple of dollars in them, and the ones from my family members have contained larger bills. One of the envelopes didn't have my name on it, but it was a pile, so I opened it. The card had a generic floral pattern on its face and seemed to be a card that I had received by someone else who was now recycling it for my birthday because I was actually a little dingy. I actually appreciate the idea, and it was a reused card since I always thought those cards were silly. I angled to it so the money wouldn't fall onto the floor when I opened it, but the only thing that was inside the message that had come printed in the card was, "I love you." Whoever had given me the card hadn't write anything in it, but had circled the message in a pencil a couple of times. I chuckled a little and said, "Gee, thanks for the awesome card, Mom." She looked at me quizzically, and I turned her attention to my card. She told me it wasn't from her, and she seemed amused, and she showed my friends, looking at their faces dry to concern, who had played the joke. None of the kids stepped forward. So my mom said, "Don't worry, sweetheart. At least you know that two people love you." She followed with what extremely prolonged, excruciating kiss on my forehead that transformed the group's bewilderment into hysteria. They were all laughing, so it could have been any of them. But Mike had seemed to be laughing the hardest, to become a participant rather than the subject of the gag. I said to him that it was just because I had just given him the card. He shouldn't have to think that I'd kiss him later. We all laughed as I looked at Josh and I saw he was finally smiling. "Well, I think that gift might be a winner, but you have a couple more to open." My mom slid another present for me. I was still feeling the tremors of suppressed chuckles in my abdomen as I tore through the colorful paper anyway. And when I saw the gift, I had no idea need to suppress the laughter anymore. My smile dropped as I looked what had been given. It was two pair of walkie-talkies. "Well, go on, show everyone." I held them up. Everyone seemed to approve, but as I drove my attention to Josh, I could see that he had a sickly shade of white. We locked eyes at the moment and then turned and walked into the kitchen. As I watched him dial a number and the corded phone attached to the wall, my mom whispered in my ear she knew that Josh and I didn't talk since one of the walkie-talkies had broken, so she thought I'd like it. I was filled with intense appreciation for my mom's thoughtfulness, but this was feeling easily overpowered by the emotions resurrected from the returning memories I had tried so hard to bury. When everyone was eating cake, I asked Josh who had called. He told me that he wasn't feeling good and he had called his dad to come and get him. I understood that he wanted to leave, but I told him that I wished we could hang out more. I extended one of the walkie talkies to him, but he put his hand up in refusal. Dejected, I said, "Well, thanks for coming, I guess. I hope I'll see you before my next birthday." "I'm sorry. I'll try to call you back more often. I really will," he said. The conversation stagnated as we waited for the door for his dad. I looked at his face. Josh seemed generally more remorseful than he had made much of an effort. His mood seemed suddenly blustered by the idea that struck him. He told me that he knew that he'd get me for my birthday, and it would take me a while, but he thought that I would really like it. I told him that it wasn't really a big deal, but he insisted. He seemed to be in bigger spirits and apologized for being such a drag at my party. He said that he was tired and that he hadn't been sleeping well, and I asked him why was that he opened up the door in response to his dad honking at the driveway. He then turned back and waved me a goodbye and answered my question. "I think I've been sleepwalking." That was the last time I saw my friend in a couple of months. Later, he was gone. Over the past weeks, the relationship between my mother and I hasn't grown increasingly strained due to my attempts to learn the details of my childhood. It's often been the case since one cannot know the breaking point of a thing until the thing fractures. And after the last conversation with my mother, I imagine that we will spend the rest of our lives attempting to repair what had been taken a lifetime to build. She had put so much energy keeping it safe, both physically and psychologically. But I think that the walls were meant to insulate me from harm, was protecting her emotionally and stability. As the truth pouring out the last time we spoke, I could hear the trembling of her voice that I think it was reverberation of the collapse of her world. I don't imagine my mother and I would talk very much anymore. And while there have been some things I don't understand, I think I know enough. After Josh disappeared, his parents had done all that day they could do to find him. From the very first day, the police had suggested they contacted all of Josh's parents and friends to see if he was with them. They did this, of course, none of them seemed to see him or have any idea where he would be. The police were unable to turn over any new information about Josh's whereabouts, despite the fact that they had received several anonymous phone calls from a woman urging them to compare this case with the stalking case that had just been opened about 6 years before. If Josh's mother's grip on the world loosened and their son vanished, it broke when Veronica died. She had seen many people die at the hospital, but there was no amount of dissentation that would fortify a person against the death of their own child. She would visit Veronica at least twice a day when she was recuperating from a different hospital, once before her shift and once afterwards. On the day Veronica died, her mother was leaving late for work, but by the time she arrived at her daughter's hospital, Veronica had already passed. It was too much for her, and the next couple of weeks became increasingly more unstable. She would often wander outside for yelling for both Josh and Veronica to come home, and there have been several times where her husband found her wandering around my old neighborhood in the middle of the night, half clothed and frantically searching for her son and daughter. Due to his wife's mental deterioration, Josh's dad could no longer travel for work and began taking construction jobs that were less well paying so he could be closer to home. When they began expanding my old neighborhood more, about 3 months after Veronica died, Josh's dad applied for every position that was hired. He was qualified to leave the build states, but he took a job as a laborator and helped to build the frames and cleaned up the sites of whatever else was needed. He even took the odd jobs that would occasionally come up, mowing lawns, repairing fences, anything that keep them from traveling. They began clearing the woods area next to the dereliction to transform land into inhabitable property. Josh, his dad, was tasked with the responsibility of leveling their recently deforested lot. His job granted him at least several weeks of work. One day he arrived at the spot that he could not level. Each time he drove over it, it would remain lower than all the surrounding land. Frustrated, he got out of the machines to survey the area. He was tempted to simply pick more dirt to the depression, but he knew that it would already be aesthetic and temporary solution. He had worked construction for years and knew that the root systems were formed large trees that had been recently cut down from often decomposed, leaving the weakness in the soil that would manifest its weakness from the foundations above. He would weigh these options and electric to dig a little, with each shovel in the case of problems was shallow, was enough to fix, needing the machine that would leave to be brought over him to another site. And as my mother described where this was, I knew that I had been at the spot before the soil was broken and before it had been filled. I felt a tightening in my chest. He dug a small hole about 3 feet down until his shovel collided with something hard. He smashed his shovel against it repeatedly, attempting to gouge at the thickness of the root, the density of the network, until suddenly his shovel plunged into the resistance. Confused, he dug the hole wider. About half an hour of excavating, he found himself standing on a brown blanket covered in a box, 7 feet down and 4 feet wide. Our minds work to avoid the dissonance, but if we hold a belief strongly, though, our minds would forcefully reject conflicting evidence, so that would maintain the integrity of the understanding of the world. Up until that moment, despite all what the sense could have indicated, despite the fact that some small, suffocated part of him stood where it was supporting his weight, this man believed he knew his son was alive. My mom called it at 6 p.m. She knew who it was, but she couldn't really understand what he was saying. But she did comprehend what made her leave immediately. "Down here! Now! Son! Please, God!" When she arrived, she found Josh's dad sitting perfectly still with back to his hole. He was holding the shovel so tightly, it seemed that it might snap, and he was staring straight ahead. Its eyes looked as if they were lifeless as a shark. He wouldn't respond to any of the other words, and only reacted when she tried to gently take the shovel from him. He dragged his eyes slowly to hers and said, "I don't understand." He repeated this as if he had forgotten all other words, and my mother could still hear him, muttering, as if he walked past him just to look at the hole. She told me that she wished that she had gouged her eyes out before she faced downward into the crater, and I told her that I knew what she was about to say and that she did not need it to continue. I looked at her face with the expressing look of such intense despair that it caused my stomach to churn. I realized as a result she had came down to this for almost 10 years and was hoping that she would never have to tell me. As a result, she never came up with the proper arrangement of words to describe what she saw, and I just sat there, I met with the same difficulty of articulation. Josh was dead. His face was sunken, contorted in such a way as if misery and hopelessness all over the world had been transferred to it. Assaulting the smell of decay rose from the crypt, and my mother had covered her nose and mouth just to keep it from vomiting. His skin was cracked, almost crocodilian, and the stream of blood that followed on these lines were dried. His face was after pooling in the staining of wood around his head. His eyes lay half-lidded, facing straight up. She said by the look of him he had not been long dead, and thus time had not brought the mercy of degradation to erase the pain and terror that now was etched onto his face. She said that it was because he fixed his gaze right onto her. His mouth was offering an all too late plea for help. The rest of his body, however, wasn't visible. Someone was covering it. He was a large and lay face down on top of Josh, and as my mother's mind etched itself onto it to intake what her eyes were attempting to tell her, she had become aware of the significance of the way which she had laid. He was holding Josh. Her legs lay frozen by death, but entangled like vines in some lush, tropical forest. One arm rested under Josh's neck, only wrapped around his body, so that they may lay closer still. As the sun passed through the trees, its light became reflected by something pinned to Josh's shirt. My mother stopped at one knee and raised another at the collar of her shirt to her nose so that she would block out the smell. When she saw that what he had caught sun in her legs abandoned her, she had nearly fell into the tomb. It was a picture. It was a picture of me as a child. She staggered backwards, gasping and trembling, collided with Josh's father, who sat facing away from the hole. She understood why he called her, but she couldn't bring herself to tell him what she had kept from everyone after all those years. Josh's family never knew about the night I had woken up in the woods. She now knew that she would have told him, but to tell him now would be nothing. She sat up there, resting her back against Josh's dad as she spoke. I can't tell my wife. I can't tell her that our little boy. His speech was staggered as his fist pressed against his wet face to his dirt-caked-like hands. She couldn't bear it. After a moment, he stood up, shuddering, and lumbered down to the grave with a final sob. He then stood down into the coffin. Josh's dad was a big man, but was not as big as the man in the box. He grabbed the back of the man's collar and pulled it harder. It was intended to throw the man out of the grave and into singular motion. But the collar ripped from the body, fell right back down to the top of his son. You motherfucker! He grabbed the man by the shoulders and heaved him back until he was off of Josh and sat awkwardly up against the wall of the small grave. He looked at the man, staggered to take a step back. Oh God, no, 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 please, God, no, please, God, no! In struggling of the powerful movement, he lifted and pushed the corpse completely off the ground, and both heard the sound of glass rolling against the wood. It was a bottle he had handed to my mother. It was Eva. Oh, Josh, she sobbed. My boy, my baby boy. Why is there so much blood? What did he do to you? As my mother looked up at the man who was laying facing upwards, she realized that she was facing the person who had haunted their lives for over a decade. She had imagined him so many times, always evil and always terrifying, and the cries of Josh's father seemed to confirm her worst fears. But as she stared at his face, she had thought that this didn't look as if she imagined. This was just a man. As she looked at this frozen expression, it actually looked serene. The corners of the lips were turned up only slightly. She only saw that he was smiling, not the expected smile of the maniac, or from a film, or from a horror story, not the smile of a demon, or the smile of a fiend. This was a smile of the contentment or satisfaction. It was a smile of bliss. It was a smile of love. She then looked down from his face, saw a tremendous wound on his neck, and the skin that had been ripped out. She was first relieved, and when she first realized how hot the blood would have been Josh's, perhaps that he had suffered less. But this comfort was short lived, and she now just realized how wrong she was. She brought a hand up to her mouth and whispered, almost as if she was afraid to remind the world what had been happened. If they were alive, Josh must have been bitten by the next man's neck in an attempt to get free, and although the man had died, Josh couldn't move him. I began crying when I thought of how long he may have laid there. She then looked at the man's pockets for any kind of identification, but only found a piece of paper. On it was a drawing of a man holding hands with a small boy, and next to the boy were the initials. My initials. I'd like to think that she was remembering the part of the story accurately, but I will never know for sure. As Josh's father carried his son out of his grave, my mom slid the piece of paper into her pocket, and he kept muttering that his son's hair had been dyed. She saw that it had. It was now dark brown, as she noticed that it was dressed oddly. His clothes were far too small. After Josh's dad delicately laid his boy on the soft dirt, he began gently pressing his hands against his son's pants to feel his pockets. When he heard a crinkle, carefully retrieved the folded piece of paper from Josh's pocket. He looked at it, and it was vexed, absently, as he handed it to my mother. But she didn't recognize it either. I asked her what it was. She told me it was a map, and I felt my heart shatter. He was finishing the map, and that must have been his idea for my birthday present. When I found out strangely, hoping that he hadn't taken a while expanding it, as if it somehow would matter now. She heard Josh's father grunt as he looked to see him pushing the man's body back down to the ground. As he walked back towards the machine where he had found a spot for him, he put an old canister of gasoline and paused with his back towards my mother. You should go. I'm sorry. It's not your fault. I did this. You can't think like that. There was nothing. He interjected flatly, almost with no emotion at all. About a month ago, a guy approached me as I was cleaning up the site on the new development for a new block over. He asked me if I wanted to take some extra money, and because my wife's not working right now, I accepted it. He told me that some kids had dug up a bunch of holes on the property and offered me $100 to fill them. He said to me that he wanted to take some pictures for the insurance company first, but if I came back after 5 p.m. the next day, that would be fine. I thought this guy was a sucker once I knew I was clearing the lot, since coming up, someone would have had to do it anyway. But I needed the money, and so I agreed. I didn't even think even this would be $100, but he put the bill on my hand, and then I did the job the next day. I have been so exhausted that I didn't even think about it after I was done. I didn't even think about it until today when I pulled the same guy off my son. He pointed at the grave, his emotions starting to push through as he broke into a sob. He paid me $100 so I would bury him with my boy. It's as if saying I would allow him to force him to accept what had been happened and collapse onto the ground with tears. My mom could think of nothing to say. I stood there in silence for a while, what felt like a lifetime. She finally asked what I could do about Josh. His final resting place won't be there with this monster. As she looked back, she reached for her car, and she picked up the black smoke, billowing the scuffling against the amber sky, and hoped that Josh's parents would be okay. I left my mom's house without saying much else. I told her that I loved her and that I would talk to her soon, but I don't know what soon means for us. I got in my car and left. I understood now the events of my childhood had stopped years ago. As an adult, I now saw the connections that were lost as a child, who tend to see the world in snapshots rather than a sequence. I thought about Josh. I loved him then, and I loved him even still. I still miss him now, even though I'll never see him again. And I find myself wishing that I hugged him the last time I saw him. And I thought about Josh's parents. Now, how much they lost and how quickly that loss had become. They don't even know about my connection to any of this. But I could never look at them in the eyes now. I thought about Veronica. I had only really come to know her later in my life, but for those brief weeks, I think I actually loved her. I thought about my mother, and she said she had to hard to protect me. I was stronger than I would ever be. I try not to think about the man and what he had done with Josh no more than 2 years. Mostly, when I just thought about Josh, sometimes I wish he never sat across from me that day in kindergarten. I'd never known what it was like to have a real friend. Sometimes I feel like I like to dream about that he's in a better place. But that was only a dream, and I know it. The world is now a cruel place, and made it crueler still by the man. There would be no justice for my friend, no final confrontation, no vengeance. It had been over for almost a decade for everyone, but for me now. I miss you, Josh. I'm sorry you chose me, but I'll always cherish my memories with you. We are explorers, we are adventurers, we were friends.